Hello everyone, and welcome back to Sage and Stone Homestead, where my husband Levi and I have been producing as much of our own food as possible since 2019. We have had a really awesome tomato year, and tonight I'm going to be canning up some barbecue sauce that I made from those tomatoes using our Fruit Saver steam canner. I'm going to show you everything there is to know about this steam canner and show you exactly how easy it is to can up your high acid foods. Before we get into all of that though, we really need to address the elephant in the room, this. For some reason, there seems to be a rumor going around that steam canning is not an approved canning method per the USDA. I'm here to tell you that that is absolutely not true. Steam canning was actually tested in Wisconsin in 2015, so it's been an approved method for quite some time. So if you ever see somebody saying that it's not an approved method, I encourage you to share this video with them, or simply share them the links that I have in the description box below that give them all the details that they're going to need. There were two different canners tested in 2015, and even though this says Fruit Saver on the top, the Fruit Saver brand is owned by Victoria Kitchen Products, and this happens to be one of the canners that was tested. I'm going to place a link in the description box where I bought this canner in case you want to check it out. It is not an affiliate link, it's just where I bought mine. So I won't be showing you how to make barbecue sauce today. This will just be how to can in the Fruit Saver canner. But if you're interested in this recipe, that's also going to be in the description box. So let's get talking about this. One of the things that I absolutely love about this canner is that it is extremely light. Let's weigh it. Looks like it clocks in at 3¼ pounds, and that's without any water in it. You can probably tell that I am canning on a glass top stove. A lot of people get really nervous about putting heavy canning pots on their glass top stove, and that worry is alleviated by using something as light as this. So this canner actually has four main parts. We have the lid, and we also have a really nice temperature gauge up here that tells you when you are safe to start your canning time. We'll definitely get into more of those details in a little bit, but basically this is going to be what you're going to use to make sure that you are canning safely for your altitude. This is the trivet or the rack that sits in the bottom tray. This keeps your jars elevated up off of the bottom of the canner so they're not in contact with the heat source and be prone to cracking. So don't forget to put this in there. And then of course we have our bottom tray. This tray is what holds in the water. We only need to use 2½ quarts to can up everything that we're going to can up today, and that helps this canner remain extremely light and also makes it heat up really, really fast. Got our 2½ quarts of water in the canner, and that brings the water level in the canner to just under the little holes on the trivet. Now this is not a required step, but I always like to add a splash of vinegar. It helps keep the calcium that's in our hard water off of my jars and helps keep them sparkly. Now I'm going to turn my burner on a medium heat because it's just about time to pack our jars. This is going to allow the water in the bottom of the canner to come up to a good temperature to keep everything well heated. Our jars are actually in the oven heating up to 180 degrees, and we're going to be putting a hot liquid inside the jars. If we were to put hot liquid on top of cool canning parts, we risk cracking our jars, and that would be a major heartbreak. When you're using the steam canner to can up any of the approved canning recipes, you want to make sure that you're using a recipe that is also approved for water bath canning. The timing and all of the other procedures are identical. So because you can only use water bath canning approved recipes in the steam canner, that does mean that you're not able to can low acid foods in the steam canner. So things like green beans, meat, and potatoes are not going to be approved to can in the steam canner, but that's okay because there's plenty of other things like jams, jellies, pickles, tomato products, anything with a high acidity. I'm going to place a link in the description box for the National Center for Home Food Preservation. If you have any questions about high acid foods, they're going to have the answer for you. Or you can always ask in the comment section down below. I try to answer every question that comes my way. So because I'm canning with homegrown tomatoes with an unknown acidity level, I am going to bring up the acidity level of the tomatoes by using some citric acid. Now, this isn't necessarily part of the recipe that I used, but it's never going to hurt to use more acid in a high acid recipe. If you ever want to calm the acidity down in some of your high acid canned foods, you can always temper that acidity by adding sugar later. So that was 1/4 teaspoon of citric acid per pint. And now it's time to ladle the hot food into hot jars. This specific canning recipe calls for me to leave a 1/2 inch headspace. And when you see the term headspace used, what that means is the air space allowed at the top of the food, between the top of the food and the lid of the jar. There's actually a neat little tool that comes with a lot of canning accessory kits, and this is the debubbler and headspace tool. You can see these little stair steps here. These measure out the headspace for you. So we're looking for a 1/2 inch headspace, which means we're gonna stick this little stair step on the rim of the jar and make sure that the food barely touches. That means that we've got a really good headspace measurement, and it looks like I've got it down. I'm actually going to use a wooden chopstick here to swirl around the contents of the jar a little bit and release any potential air bubbles. If I failed to do this, I could actually interfere with that headspace that we've achieved, and that can affect the quality of the seal. So we want to make sure that there's no bubbles down below and that our headspace is accurate. Next step is putting lids on all of the jars. And before I go ahead and pop any lids on, I want to make sure that the rim of each jar is completely clean. If there's anything left behind, that could really compromise the seal, and that's not the point of this whole process. We want all of these jars to be perfectly sealed. So all I've got on this rag here is a dab of vinegar, and that's going to help dissolve any fats or sugars or anything that could be stuck on the rim. So I've put the lids on, now I'm placing the bands, what's called fingertip tight. So I don't want to crank down real hard on these bands. I want to allow enough space for this flexible lid to be able to expand a little bit and expel some air. That's going to be really important for the vacuum sealing process, which is essentially what we're achieving here. While the contents are hot and bubbly, it's going to let some air out, and as it cools down, the lid will suck down onto the jar, sealing everything inside. We need to allow that air to escape, so we can't crank down on the lid really hard, but we also can't leave it so loose that it won't adhere to the rim of the jar like it's supposed to. So there's a sweet spot there, and I'll show you how to get there. It's best when you're learning how to do fingertip tight if you do it on a smooth counter. So I'm going to remove it off of the towel. It's a little hot. So I'm going to put the ring around the lid, and I'm going to allow the whole jar to spin with just the pressure of my fingers. When we're at this point, we're going to give the ring a 1/4 turn with some pressure on the jar, and that is as tight as it needs to be. That is perfect. I'm actually going to be filling some 1/2 pint jars up as well, and these take only 1/8 of a teaspoon of citric acid. Looks like I'm not going to be able to get all of the jars in the canner that I wanted. It's really important that the lid, when it goes on, then it fits on as it should. If I crammed all of the jars into the bottom here, there'd be a really good chance that my lid wouldn't sit all the way down on top of the base here as it should, and I don't want to do that. So I'm going to leave this one out, and we'll put it in the fridge. We'll use it within the week. So, really important tip, when you're placing the lid on your canner, you want to put this steam vent hole towards the back. There's going to be a lot of steam venting out of here, and you don't want to accidentally burn yourself. Just like so. So at this point, I'm going to turn my burner up to high, and we're going to be watching the steam coming out of the back, and we're going to be watching the dial gauge up here. We are canning in an elevation of less than 1,000 feet. We're in southwestern Kentucky, and so we need to wait until the red indicator bar reaches the dark green. One of the major things that I love about the steam canner, so much more than the water bath canner, other than the weight of it, is it does not take very long to heat up. Normally when you're water bath canning, you need to create enough water to make an inch worth of water covering all of the jars in the canner. That much water takes a really long time to heat up. Again, we're only using 2.5 quarts in this canner right now. That's going to take basically no time to heat up, and it saves a lot of time when you're canning a lot of things like we are. I can already hear it hissing. I don't know if you can. Another really important thing to take note of is that it is not suggested that you use the steam canner for any canning recipes that require the food to be processed for longer than 40 minutes. And the reason for that is that the steam canner, because it uses so little water, could boil dry. So you want to make sure during the whole canning process that there is steam venting out the back, because if you have boiled dry inside the steam canner, the food is no longer considered safe and you have to start over. It is not safe at any point to open the canner and add water. You want to make sure that the canner stays shut for the entire length of the canning time. And I'm touching it right now. I want to remind you that the outside of the canner is hot, so be aware of that. I don't think it's really picking up on camera, but I'm starting to see steam venting out of the back. And we're looking here at this red gauge. I need it to come all the way into this dark green area. If at any time during this heat up process or during the canning process you're noticing the lid starting to lift and jiggle, very carefully lower the heat, because that means you're getting really close to your temperature being ideal, and you want to make sure you keep that steam within the canner. The only place that the steam should be venting out of the canner is through that back vent hole. A lot of times, just as an added measure, I like to weight down the top of my canner just to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. Remember that the top of this canner is very, very hot, so make sure it's something heat safe and that you're careful when you're putting it on and taking it off. Things like your husband's espresso maker, they work perfectly. So we have achieved our temperature goal. This red indicator bar is within the dark green area. So now I can set my timer, which for this recipe is 20 minutes. During the canning process, you may notice that more and more steam is starting to build up and things are really heating up in there. It is okay to turn down the heat a little bit. It's actually probably advised for some of those longer canning times because of the canner possibly boiling dry like we talked about before. As long as you're keeping an eye on the fact that there is steam continually flowing out of the back of the canner and the indicator bar is still within range, everything is going to be fine. So right now I'm at about a medium high. I'm going to turn my canner down to a medium and keep my eye on it. There are steam canners that don't have this gauge on top, and from what I understand, as long as the inside temperature of the canner reaches between 210 degrees and 212 degrees, that it is a safe canning environment. And you can check on that by very carefully placing a meat thermometer through that vent hole to check the inside temperature. I really, really like this particular model though. I feel like the gauge on top is relatively fail-safe, and it looks like in testing it seems really, really accurate. Another important thing too that I forgot to mention, you notice that I had 2 different size jars in the canner. It's really important that if you're going to be canning 2 different size jars, which you can, that you use the canning time for the largest size jar. So we have half pints and pints in there, the pints being the larger size, so we're going to use the timing for the pint size jars. Just so happens that there isn't a timing for a half pint jar, but if I were to use, let's say, quarts and pints, we would want to use the quart timing. So the canner is done and the burner's been turned off, and the instructions with my canner said to allow the canner to sit on the burner and cool down slowly for 5 minutes. This is a rare treat on my channel. This is my cat, Remington. And the other one, her name is Punt. She's a little less snuggly. Should I put you down? Because I've canned a tomato product, I'm going to take an additional step that isn't really necessary. It's not part of the rule book, but I find that tomato products kind of readily bubble up and do what's called siphoning. And essentially, that's when things start to cool down a little bit too quickly. For some reason, tomato products like to bubble out the top and spew over, and I would really love to avoid that. So in order to avoid that with the steam canner, all I'm going to do is tilt the lid a little bit. There we go. Whoop. And let it sit like this for an additional 10 minutes before we can remove the jars. Did you hear that click? I did. They're starting to pop. As a rule, all of your canning jars should be allowed to cool down on the counter at an ambient temperature. You want to keep them away from drafts because a sudden cool down like that could cause the jars to crack, but you don't necessarily want to leave them in the canner overnight to cool down. That can make a heat-loving bacterium that is quite safe to eat but has an off flavor really proliferate in the jars. It's something called flat sour. If you want to learn more about flat sour, I'll put a link in the description box. I have had it happen to me, so try to avoid cooling things down in the canner. I have done it before. I do still continue to do it sometimes, but generally not with tomato products. And that wouldn't be following the rules. So make sure when you're learning how to can that you're following the rules to a T. So it looks like all of our jars survived the canning process quite well. Sometimes when canning, you will have the occasional lid that kind of pops off in the canner. That can be due to either a too tight band or a too loose band. What happens in a water bath canner, because all of the jars are submerged, if and when a seal fails, you lose all of the contents of that jar. And when you work hard to raise your own food or buy food locally, that can be really heartbreaking. But with a steam canner, if that does happen, you generally don't lose any contents of the jar, and you have the ability to either reprocess or just put that food in the refrigerator and use it within a week. But that sound right there, that's exactly what we're looking for. That was the last jar that had to pop, and that popping sound indicates that we have a good seal. I'm going to let these jars cool down on the counter overnight before I remove the bands, give them a good cleaning, and put them up on the shelf with their labels. This was only a 20-minute canning process, and it looks like we didn't really lose much water at all to the steaming process, which is awesome. Make sure if you're going to be doing multiple batches in the steam canner that you pay attention to that water level and keep it at just below that little trivet. Oftentimes when I know I'm going to be canning the next day, I'll just leave the same water and vinegar in the canner on the stove. You have my permission to do so as well. I'm actually doing that tonight because Stiver's Homestead just posted about bruschetta in a can, and I have to try it. Pretty much this whole growing season, I have put up the harvest using the steam canner. I took a couple videos showing us processing our tomatoes and processing our peppers, and I use the steam canner in both of those videos. So whichever one sounds most interesting to you, go ahead and give it a click. If they both look interesting, click the pepper video because I link the tomato video at the end of that one. I'm going to use the pint. Ow. I told you guys not to do that. Oh my God, that's the second time.